Today, 21st June, by my calculations, is the 18th day of Ukraine's offensive, the offensive which Ukraine launched on the 4th of June, and which has been continuing ever since the start, ever since that day. And for the moment, it seems as if we are still in that period when fighting has diminished to a great extent. Some people continue to talk about it as an operational pause. Russian commentators are of the view that this is only a temporary abatement of the fighting. They expect that having reorganized their forces, regrouped their forces, brought in reinforcements, Ukraine will resume the attacks at some point in the next couple of days. And I think this is probably correct. I think that Ukraine at the moment is not prepared to give up its offensive. I think that the political imperatives to continue to conduct the offensive remain strong. The United States apparently still wants to see the offensive prosecuted. There are reports in the US media. I have to say, if they are correct, I haven't actually read them myself, but if they are correct, and they really do say what some reports say that they say, which is that the United States had always anticipated heavy losses by Ukraine, and that the losses Ukraine has experienced up to this point are not unexpected. Well, I have to say that I find that very chilling, and I do question whether it's appropriate for a third party, the United States, to insist that another country conduct an offensive which leads to casualties on this kind of scale. But anyway, that's a matter for the United States and Ukraine to argue out, no doubt, between them. We can all comment about this, but we have little influence, those of us who are not part of this debate that no doubt is going on in the United States. I have to say that my sense is that within the US leadership and the political class, there really isn't that much interest in the human cost of this offensive to Ukraine. But anyway, let's move on. The fact is that the US still wants the offensive pursued. It increasingly seems as if this is seen as politically essential for the future of the Biden administration and for President Biden's hopes of re-election next year. So the offensive will continue. Now, I said that there was something of a lull in the fighting. It would be a big mistake to think that this means that the fighting has stopped entirely. I'm going to go to the Russian Defense Ministry report, which gives us some accounts of what's going on in the fighting. Yesterday, the previous 24 hours. As I said, I want to stress this is the Russian Ministry of Defense report. It is the most detailed official report of what is happening on the battlefields from either side in this conflict. It doesn't mean that you have to accept every word as absolutely, unchallengeably true. I do not, but I will say that overall, I have found Russian Defense Ministry reports, especially when they talk about fighting like this, to be reasonably accurate, to give a reasonably good view of what is going on in any particular time and place, in any particular battle. So I'm going to read out what it says, and this will just get a sense of what has been happening over the last 24 hours. And it reads as follows: the Ukrainian armed forces have continued their unsuccessful attempts to conduct offensive operations in South Donetsk, Zaporozhye, and Donetsk directions during the past 24 hours. And I should say this is 24 hours up to the evening of the 20th of June. And so this is a report that's now several hours old. But anyway, to continue. 4 attacks launched by Ukrainian motorized infantry units, reinforced by tanks, were repelled by skillful and coordinated actions of the Vostok group of forces, aviation, artillery, and heavy flamethrowers in Vremevka salient and Orekhov tactical directions. 3 tanks and 5 armoured fighting vehicles have been destroyed. In addition, 4 clusters of enemy manpower and equipment were engaged near Novopol and Levadnoye. In Pologi, tactical direction, actions of 1 sabotage and reconnaissance group of the armed forces of Ukraine have been thwarted near Reshetilovskoye. Total enemy losses in the South Donetsk and Zaporozhye directions overnight were up to 260 Ukrainian servicemen killed or wounded, 9 tanks, a Bradley infantry fighting vehicle, 12 armoured fighting vehicles, 3 motor vehicles, 2 D-20 howitzers, 2 Star B howitzers, as well as a US-made M777 artillery system. Now, the Russian authorities here are not giving us a huge amount of detail about the actual fighting, and note that they're no longer distinguishing between the fighting at the Vremevka salient, Vremevka ledge, and the area near Orekhov, which is substantially to the west of the fighting in the Vremevka ledge. Now, can I say that the probable reason why they're doing that is because the attacks that took place in these different places were on a relatively small scale, and there is no information that I've seen from any source which reliably suggests that there's been any change in the overall military positions. The Russians are still present at the Vremevka ledge, from whence the Ukrainians sought to drive them out way back on the 4th of June, and the Russians are still there, and there's been no significant movement forward, as of the time of making of this video at least, in the Orekhov area either. To repeat, all of these areas are in the control zone created by the Russians ahead of their fortifications, their great fortifications. These are in the rear, despite all the time and fighting that's been taking place, despite all the strenuous efforts Ukraine has made, the very heavy losses that it's experienced. Ukraine has still not broken through. It's not been able to clear the Russian forces from this area, this control area ahead of the fortifications. It has not actually reached the fortifications. And even on what the Russians say was a quiet day, the Russians claim that 260 Ukrainian soldiers were killed or wounded, and that might be true. We've no way of corroborating that figure one way or the other. But they also provide substantial evidence of equipment losses, or at least substantial claims of equipment losses. And as I said, I consider these to be significantly more reliable. So they say 9 tanks. Now, they don't suggest that these are Western tanks, so they are presumably drawn from the diminishing stock now of T-64 and T-72, and some increasingly say T-62 Soviet-era tanks, which previously formed the mainstay of Ukraine's arsenal. A single Bradley infantry fighting vehicle. And again, this is interesting that Ukraine seems to have stopped using these Western supplied vehicles, infantry fighting vehicles, the Bradleys and the Strikers, in large clusters. They seem to be using them now increasingly in penny packets, and the result is that the Russians are able to destroy one on a particular day. Doesn't mean that only one Bradley was committed to the fighting. It means that one Bradley was destroyed. There were probably others, and they probably withdrew. And the same must have been true of the Striker as well. But the fact that, as I said, Ukraine is limiting the losses of these vehicles suggests that they are not there right on the front line. It suggests that they're being deployed, as I said, in penny packets behind the tanks and the infantry to try to exploit any gains which are achieved, but that they nonetheless still come within the range of Russian artillery and drones and whatever. And the result is that every day or so, one more of these vehicles, of which, to repeat again, Ukraine doesn't have an unlimited number, one more of these vehicles gets knocked out. And we learn that 12 armoured fighting vehicles were destroyed, and it's quite likely in this case that these are mainly Western vehicles. The Russians don't identify them, but they generally don't identify armoured fighting vehicles, be they ex-Soviet or Western. And it seems to me that most of the armoured fighting vehicles that Ukraine has are now Western. So M113s, other types of weapons of that, machines of that kind. And then perhaps the most interesting of all, because alongside the two D-20 howitzers, these are Soviet-era towed howitzers, we hear that two Star B howitzers, this is an advanced, very advanced for its time, Soviet-era howitzer from the 1980s. Again, I doubt that Ukraine has a huge stock of these, but two of them were destroyed. These are self-propelled howitzers, armoured self-propelled howitzers, and another US-made M777 has also been destroyed. So that's what the Russians say, and I think these figures are reasonably accurate. Now, notice that the Russians are not providing any battleground information about the fighting in Piatikhatki. Now, yesterday I saw on Reba map, much clearer map than most of the others that I've seen of this fighting, and they give a clear picture of where the various locations are. And I would say straight away that Piatikhatki is further to the west than I had realized. It is at the western end of the combat line. It is not that far, in fact, from the east bank of the Dnieper River. So if we are looking at the area in contention, the Vremevka ledge is at the eastern end, Piatikhatki is at the western end. And the suggestion that's been made is that the purpose of the attack on Piatikhatki is to try to capture, consolidate control of this village, push south of this village, capture further places, and create a situation where conceivably, if there is an across the border, across the river raid, if the Ukrainians try to cross the Dnieper River into Kherson region onto the east bank, then they will already have a kind of bridgehead south of Piatikhatki that they can exploit in order to link up with their amphibious forces that have crossed the Dnieper and achieved this bridgehead in this particular area. This would be a bridgehead, by the way, from what I can see, north of where the Novaya Kakhovka Dam used to be. Anyway, that's what some people are speculating. I don't see that there's any reason to doubt that. Anyway, Piatihatki has turned out to be another cemetery, I'm sorry to put it in that stark way, for Ukrainian soldiers. What happens is that every day or so they advance into Piatihatki. The Russian troops who were stationed there in relatively light numbers pull back. The Russians then bombard Ukrainian troops in Piatihatki, as they can do because they control the higher ground in this area to the south, and Piatihatki itself is in effect taken into a kind of semicircle. The Ukrainians, under the pressure of this bombardment, eventually are forced to withdraw, and they withdraw to a wooded area slightly to the north, and the Russians reoccupy Piatihatki, not with large numbers of men, but with scouts and people like that. So this has been going on day after day now for several days. Ukraine taking several heavy losses, but unable to concentrate or consolidate in Piatihatki because of the intensity of Russian artillery fire. And this battle has been going backwards and forwards for days now. Again, my understanding is that as of the time of the making of this program, Piatihatki continues to be controlled by the Russians, though only very lightly. Perhaps it's better to refer to it as being in the grey zone. But regardless, the Ukrainians up to this point have not managed to consolidate their positions there. So, again, the picture overall is that the Ukrainians have failed to make any significant breakthroughs. And I would say that even in Piatihatki, even if the Ukrainians are trying to push south to create some kind of bridgehead area that might potentially, in the future, link up with the amphibious force crossing the Dnieper from the West Bank. Well, if that is the plan, then they will have to push significantly further south from Piatihatki to be safely in that position. And of course, again, the main barrier, the really heavy Russian fortifications, continue to be well to the south. Now, that's, it seems to me, an overview of the battles, the actual battles on the front lines yesterday. I will say that the Russian Defense Ministry has provided some information about fighting in other places, and they say that in the Donetsk direction, that's to say in Donetsk region, the Yug group of forces has successfully repelled 10 enemy attacks close to Krasnogorovka, Avdeevka, and Marinka. Now, I think the Krasnogorovka, in this case, which is being referred to, is the one closer to Avdeevka, which was captured by the Russians, from my memory, back in March. There's another one, apparently, near Marinka. But anyway, Krasnogorovka, Avdeevka, and Marinka. And they say that up to 220 Ukrainian personnel, 3 armored fighting vehicles, 7 motor vehicles, a Star B howitzer, and a US-made M777 artillery system have been neutralized during the combat. And again, notice that the losses in these, as the Russians say, unsuccessful attacks in the central Donbass area, that the losses there, according to the Russians, 220 men and wounded, is in the same order of magnitude as the Ukrainians have suffered in their main offensive further south, and that, again, the Ukrainians, according to the Russians, lost a Star B howitzer, powerful Soviet-era self-propelled 152mm howitzer, and another US-made M777. So, according to the Russians, it remains very much at the moment that the Ukrainians continue to be stuck and that their offensive isn't making much progress, but they do continue to make attacks, and even on these quiet days, the Ukrainians suffer losses, and the losses, according to the Russians, are in the hundreds. Now, these are Russian figures. As I said, we don't have corroboration, but it is accepted now that there are heavy losses. I noticed that even The Guardian is reporting that the Ukrainians are suffering heavy losses as they try to continue with this offensive. The size, the precise number of the losses may be subject of dispute. The fact that Ukraine is suffering heavy losses in this offensive and is gaining very little ground. The Guardian talked about advancing one hamlet at a time at the cost of these heavy losses. Well, the fact that these heavy losses are happening is not in dispute, and I think I should make that very clear. And some Russian officials yesterday were saying that this can only go on now for another 3 weeks or so before it finally runs its course. I think they're partly basing that not just on the scale of the battlefield losses, but on the fact that the Russian missile and air forces continue their big offensive, their missile and drone offensive, knocking out ammunition depots and other military infrastructure that Ukraine has tried to create to support this offensive. It seems that they're able to do that now with very little real difficulty, that Ukrainian air defenses have essentially collapsed, such as they exist. They've now been concentrated in Kiev itself. There are a few air defense systems on the front lines, but they seem to be largely unsuccessful. As I said yesterday, up to this moment in time, not a single Russian helicopter gunship has been shot down. No doubt one will be eventually, but as of this time, more than one no doubt, as of this time, none has been successfully shot down. And if you look at the map, compare the map as it was before the 3rd of June, before the offensive began, and the map today, you can see how small and insignificant these Ukrainian gains achieved at this enormous cost, well, as I said, to the north of the major Russian fortified lines. How small these territorial gains that Ukraine has actually made really are. Anyway, that's the situation on the battlefields. Now, there have been reports that the Ukrainians and the British, who are advising them, have been planning some kind of big air and missile strike on some of the air bases from whence these Russian aircraft are operating. And obviously some of these air bases are located in Zaporozhye region, but they also are alleged to operate in Crimea, and I'm sure this is true. And there's stories that there will be missile strikes on air bases in Crimea, extended HIMARS missiles, Storm Shadows, perhaps even ATACMS systems. President Biden, made a comment which appeared to suggest that the United States, unsurprisingly, has relented on its decision not to supply ATACMS missiles. Perhaps the fact that the Storm Shadow has proved underwhelming has persuaded the US that it ought to reconsider its decision not to supply ATACMS after all. Supposedly 50 ATACMS missiles might be supplied to Ukraine eventually in order to support this offensive. We shall see. There's not been an announcement up to this point. But anyway, Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, has made a statement at a meeting of the Russian Defense Ministry Board, which is clearly intended to respond to this. And he says, since the 4th of June, the Ukrainian armed forces have launched 263 attacks at Russian armed positions. Due to competent and dedicated actions, all attacks have been repelled. The enemy failed to achieve its goals. Judging, however, by our information, the armed forces of Ukraine command plans to launch strikes at Russian Federation territory, including Crimea, with HIMARS and Storm Shadow missiles. Deployment of these particular missiles out of the Special Military Operations Zone will be regarded as direct involvement of the United States and Britain in the conflict and will result in immediate retaliatory strikes at decision-making centers in Ukrainian territory. Now, notice that when he talks about HIMARS missiles and extended-range HIMARS missiles, I suspect what he's referring to is ATACMS missiles, because as I understand it, ATACMS missiles are launched from HIMARS launchers. So this is, I think, what Shoigu is talking about. An attack, that there's some kind of plan afoot to launch some kind of big missile strike at Russian air bases in Crimea and southern Zaporozhye region using Storm Shadow missiles and ATACMS missiles. And Shoigu is now giving a warning. If such a thing happens, the Russians will consider it direct involvement of the USA and Britain in the conflict. And he says that they will launch immediate retaliatory strikes at decision-making centers in Ukrainian territory. Now, I discussed one of these decision-making centers that the Russians attacked, the third one, to my best knowledge, yesterday. I said that based on information that had been received, it was a sort of war room with computers and screens where commanders coordinate the operation of troops on the ground. They have an overview of the state of the battlefield from all the various intelligence systems that exist, satellites, other forms, drones, other forms of intelligence. It can all be integrated together in one place, and that enables the people who are operating the center to give clear directions to the troops on the ground, the Ukrainian troops on the ground, where the Russians are located, what their positions are, and to coordinate attacks against them. And if you want a better explanation of this than the one I can provide, then I would suggest that you go to a live stream we did yesterday on the Duran with Larry Johnson, who's a former CIA analyst. He's obviously very familiar with the concept of these operations rooms, and he provided a detailed explanation of how they work. Now, I understand that there are two others, and it could be that Shoigu is talking about Russian retaliatory attacks on these other places. But notice what he is saying. He is saying that if Ukraine launches attacks on Crimea and on other places outside the conflict zone within Russia, with Storm Shadows and potentially ATACMS missiles, then the Russians will retaliate, having concluded that the British and the Americans are directly involved. And that leads me to think that Shoigu here is giving a clear signal that the Russians know where British and American officers located in Ukraine are positioned, and that if there is such a missile strike, the Russians will retaliate by attacking these places and, in effect, going after the British and American officers and soldiers who are located there. That seems to me a very stark warning, and I suggest that it should be taken extremely seriously. I suspect some people in Britain and in the United States are taking it extremely seriously. Whether it will be enough to deter the Western powers and Ukraine from pressing forward with this kind of attack is a completely different matter. But anyway, if such an attack, a missile attack on Russian bases does take place, and the Russians do respond in this fashion, it's important to say now that the Russians have given warnings, about this. So anyway, we shall see what happens. The Russians say that they are aware of these plans. No doubt they've prepared their defenses to deal with these attacks should they come. And they've now given what I think is the starkest warning of all up to this point, that if these missile strikes happen, there will be an immediate retaliatory strike. Those are the words Shoigu uses, at decision-making centers on Ukrainian territory, and that those places which will be targeted where American and British personnel may be present. So before very long, and this is, I think, something that Americans and perhaps British people perhaps need to be aware of, before very long, we could find ourselves in a situation where British and American military people, either serving military or people who have been taken on contract, but anyway, American and British citizens are going to be intentionally targeted by the Russian army. A very dangerous development, a major escalation, but as I said, the warning has been given, and I hope, as I said, I hope the right people, the relevant people, are taking this warning from Shoigu seriously, because I think it is most important that they should. Anyway, that's all the news for the moment from the Ukrainian battlefields. There have been some other tantalizing bits of information. The Russian Defense Ministry, as well as giving us this rather interesting account of the fighting, these fightings, and this rather stark and ominous warning from Shoigu, has published this really rather strange statement and Again, it was published yesterday, and it said that in the Orechov direction, the enemy lost dozens of foreign-made hardware and hundreds of Ukrainian servicemen attempting to launch an offensive on Russian positions. During an unsuccessful offensive, Southern Ministry of Defense servicemen of the 58th Combined Arms Army and the Vostok Akhmat Battalion. The Vostok Akhmat Battalion is Chechen troops. Took servicemen of the armed forces of Ukraine's 65th Mechanized Brigade prisoners. And then it gives its account, and let me again reiterate, this is a Russian Defense Ministry account. It gives its account of what happened. Twice, their commanders deceived the Ukrainian troops with reinforcements and actual Russian force strength in the area. Otherwise, there would have been no one willing to launch an offensive at our defenses. Ukrainian unit commanders employ familiar tactics. They send soldiers to the zero line, knowing that they will not return. In other words, they send them on essentially kamikaze missions. Ukrainian servicemen were told that they had to hold the second line of defense as an infantry battalion should. But when the attack was thwarted, the servicemen made a decision to march with unit strength they had. Personnel refused to go on the offensive, and their commanders were forced to gather their men all along the front. Looking back now, the captured Ukrainian soldiers realized that they have been deceived regarding assessment of the Russian forces' manpower and the strength of NATO weaponry. Now, I have to say, I'm taking this translation directly from the English language website of the Russian Defense Ministry. The English here is very strange, and it makes it extremely difficult, and it's difficult for me to get a precise picture of exactly what happened. But anyway, the implication of this is, and seems to be the overall picture, is that in the Orechov area, Ukrainian commanders ordered a unit of the 65th Mechanized Brigade to advance on Russian lines. And they told this particular Ukrainian military unit that if they captured those lines, they should stand fast, and that a Ukrainian battalion would come to reinforce them. And they also told the Ukrainian forces, what these Ukrainian troops, their estimate of the number of Russian troops in the area, and that turned out to be completely wrong. And the Ukrainian troops, basing themselves, acting on this false information, did advance on the Russian lines. They found the Russians far stronger than they anticipated. It seems that some of these Ukrainian troops surrendered, and others withdrew. That is my understanding of this account. Now, the Russians do not give us numbers. They don't tell us how many Ukrainian soldiers withdrew. They don't tell us how many Ukrainian soldiers were captured. This might be a relatively minor incident, and perhaps we can put to one side some of the claims about cynical deception of Ukrainian soldiers by their officers. Perhaps the officers themselves genuinely had wrong information about the strength of Russian positions. But it is interesting that the Russian Defense Ministry has published this as a standalone event. And that might point to this being a rather bigger event than the norm. Maybe we're talking about hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers ordered to advance and a significant number of them taken prisoner. I don't quite see otherwise what would be the purpose of publicizing this particular incident in this kind of way. It might be intended conceivably to demoralize the Ukrainian forces, but all I could say is I wonder how many of them read the website of the Russian Ministry of Defense. So I can't quite believe that, and it seems to me that some kind of an incident did take place, and it did result in a significant number of Ukrainian prisoners being taken. Now, this is consistent with the news we are getting that numbers of prisoners captured by the Russians is growing. But as I said, I do want to stress again, we're not talking about hundreds of men from the Ukrainian lines simply coming over and giving up. This isn't that kind of a situation. It's a trickle, and however, it perhaps is possible that bigger events are taking place, and this one perhaps was one of them. And it may be a sign of what is to come. Anyway, that's, it seems to me, a reasonable overview of the situation in Ukraine. Ukrainian offensive is in deadlock. Now, yesterday, there was a report in the Turkish media from Turkish sources that the Russians have launched a major offensive on Kupiansk. And this has been widely reported, but we're not getting very much information as to exactly what is going on around Kupiansk. I suspect the reason for that is that most of the Russian military reporters and commentators, who are the ones who give us this day-by-day, blow-by-blow account of what's going on in any particular place, that they are mostly concentrated on the southern fronts where Ukraine is conducting its offensive. So the result is that we don't have eyewitness reports or very fresh reports from Kupiansk. And the Russian Defense Ministry is careful for the moment to give very little away about what is happening in the Kupiansk area. But I do get the sense that there is some kind of a Russian push in Kupiansk, around Kupiansk, underway. Whether this is a big offensive, and how big does an offensive have to be before it is called big? Well, that I simply don't know. But it does seem that some sort of Russian advance in Kupiansk, in the north, the northern end of this battlefield, is indeed underway. And the Institute for the Study of War has previously confirmed Russian advances in this area, though it's not telling us very much at the moment. I've come to the conclusion, by the way, that the Institute for the Study of War gets most of its information from the battlefields, from the same sources that I'm going to. So perhaps that's unsurprising. As I said, there's not much information coming from these sources, and the Institute for the Study of War also, therefore, is carrying less information about the fighting near Kupiansk than perhaps the situation there merits. The ISW does nonetheless tell us that the Russians have also been launching attacks of their own in the Avdiivka and Bakhmut area. The Ukrainians made big attempts over the last few weeks. They've not been widely reported. They've made big attempts to try to push back the Russians in the Bakhmut area especially, and in Avdiivka. But it seems that these attacks have been unsuccessful and Russian positions have held, and that the Russians are now pushing back in some places in both of these areas as well. And further south in Marinka, I get the sense that some kind of operational crisis for Ukraine may be developing. There are apparently now heavy concentrations of Russian troops fighting in Marinka. I said yesterday that the Russians appear to have captured some important fortified position, Ukrainian fortified position, to the southwest of Marinka, and they do seem to be pushing hard on the Ukrainian forces, still trying to cling on to a few buildings on the western edge of Marinka, and they also seem to be pressing forward towards the roads that link Marinka with places like Vuhledar, further to the south. And of course, if that happens, then Ukrainian defenses in Marinka will finally collapse, and this blasted town, blasted by months of incredibly heavy artillery fire, will finally fall entirely under Russian control. But again, details of reports about this remain very sketchy. Now, there's been much less news about the Ukraine conflict in terms of political and military developments. NATO officials seem to be talking about a long war. I share, by the way, Larry Johnson's skepticism about this. I think that given the losses Ukraine is experiencing, and given the shortages of equipment now in the West, it is going to prove increasingly difficult to sustain the Ukrainian war effort over the long period that some people are talking about. I read a report yesterday that the German military is down to 20,000 shells, which would be, one day's expenditure of shells for the Russian army in the Ukraine conflict. I mean, they don't have the shells to provide, and it seems that all attempts to find alternative supplies of shells in Japan, in South Korea, in Pakistan, that they've been largely exhausted. They will no doubt try to escalate, or at least the Western powers may be thinking of escalations with other more advanced systems, F-16 fighter jets, ATACMS, missiles. I think that given the scale of increase of Russian forces and of Russian military production, this will be nowhere near enough, and given the scale of Ukrainian equipment and manpower losses, it's going to be very difficult, I think all but impossible, for the Western powers to sustain the Ukrainian war effort for as long as perhaps they want to do. I have noticed, and this is completely unsurprising to me, that the Pentagon has again carried out what it says is a financial check, and it's discovered that in terms of the aid it's provided to Ukraine, there's been an accounting error, and there's $6 billion still to spend out of the money that had been allocated by Congress. They said it was $3 billion. They've now added another 6. I suspect we'll be seeing these games played ad infinitum. I've never taken seriously the suggestions that the United States would run out of money to send to Ukraine in terms of weapons. The problem is not a shortage of money in the United States for this sort of thing. The problem is lack of production capacity. And this is the point that the article in Politico was making. And given the absence of production capacity and the depletion of stockpiles, it becomes difficult to find ways of sustaining this war effort, however much money you throw at it. In fact, the more money you throw at the problem, the more the cost rises and the more the returns diminish. So I, like Larry Johnson, am skeptical about the view that this is a war that can be prolonged for years or decades, as people like Olaf Scholz and others fondly hope. And of course, as some officials in the United States have been trying to point out, it's not in America's interest anyway for this war to be prolonged indefinitely. But I think that as far as the Biden administration is concerned, they probably now concluded that a Ukrainian victory in this offensive is not going to be achieved. They've probably concluded that there won't be a Ukrainian victory this year. They've probably concluded that there won't be a Ukrainian victory at all. But they will want to draw this war out, not just for as long as they can, but at least beyond the presidential election next year. Because President Biden has already been embarrassed by the hasty withdrawal of the United States from Afghanistan, which many people saw as a humiliation for the United States, and he will not want a second military defeat, as many will see it, for the United States in Ukraine happening within the term of his presidency, certainly not on the eve of what could very well be a difficult election. So I think that heaven and earth will be moved to try to keep this war going, prolong this war for at least a further year and a half, at least until the election, the 24 election, the November 2024 election is finally out of the way. Whether they are able to do that, whether they can prolong the war in that way, of course, is another matter. Since I mentioned the withdrawal from Afghanistan, I would just like to say again that it's now clear to me that the United States, the Biden administration, withdrew US troops from Afghanistan in the spring and summer of 2021 because it anticipated, it knew that there would soon be a war in Ukraine, and it didn't want to expose US troops in Afghanistan to potential Russian retaliation. Not direct Russian retaliation, but Russia supplying weapons to the Taliban that might be used against American soldiers. And certain words that Secretary Blinken has uttered seem to me to essentially confirm that. That brings me back to the topic that I discussed extensively in my program yesterday, which was Secretary of State Blinken's visit to China. And I gave a detailed discussion in my program yesterday of the various readouts. And after I made the video, we discussed this program again, this visit again, on the live stream that Alex and I at the Duran did with Larry Johnson. And I set out my view that what happened in Beijing over the course of Blinken's visit was that the Chinese essentially gave the Biden administration a warning that as far as China is concerned, they're in the last chance saloon. This is the last chance the Biden administration has to ease tensions with China. Blinken went to China trying to de-escalate what is becoming a very difficult situation. And it's not difficult to understand why the Biden administration wants to do that. Because I've discussed many times that it is absolutely an impossible situation for the United States to find itself in a conflict with China at the same time that there is an ongoing conflict in Europe. And far from Russia having been militarily weakened by this conflict, the country, the superpower that has been weakened principally by it is the United States, which has had critical arsenals of weapons, of its weapons, depleted as it has been locked, trapped into a situation of having to ship more and more of them to Ukraine. Every so often we hear of angry exchanges about unending Ukrainian demands for weapons between Ukrainian officials and American officials, including between President Biden and President Zelensky. And the reason for the American anger is not difficult to understand. Simplicius, the thinker, has made what I think is the correct point, that when the Americans and the British persuaded Ukraine to persuaded President Zelensky to go back on the agreements that he and the Ukrainian government had reached with the Russians in Istanbul in March of last year, they in effect promised President Zelensky unlimited military aid. And what has happened is that the Ukrainians have cashed that check, except, of course, that it was effectively a blank check. And the Americans have found that the demands that are coming from Ukraine are not only endless, but are far greater than the US ever anticipated. So it was expected that the HIMARS would manage to turn things round. It was expected that the tanks from Europe would manage to turn things round. And by the way, the Russians are now claiming that they've destroyed several Marder infantry fighting vehicles from Germany, though this has been made in detailed reports from individual Russian units. And I noticed that the overall Russian Defense Ministry has yet to confirm this. But anyway, they sent all of these weapons. They've provided Ukraine with ammunition. They've used up their stocks of Stinger and Javelin missiles. And still Ukraine comes back for more. And now they want Patriot missiles. And the Patriot missiles, well, the Patriot missile system is a key part of the military defense system the United States is trying to create in the Pacific against China. And Ukraine is demanding more and more of these. And they are now being pushed and might eventually have to provide ATACMS missiles as well. And ATACMS missiles of which there is also a limited supply, were also basically earmarked for use against China in a conflict in the Pacific. So given that the Biden administration finds itself, in effect, in a war without end in Ukraine, and given that its arsenals are being depleted at a far faster rate than it could possibly have imagined, it's been obliged to put ideas of any kind of confrontation with China or face off against China over Taiwan or the South China Sea or anything like that. It's been forced to put all of those on the back burner, in the bottom drawer, at least for the moment, at least until the election next year is out of the way, and perhaps steps can be taken to try to bring this conflict in Ukraine to an end. And in the meantime, they're trying to at least take some of the tension out of the confrontation with the Chinese. They're not ready for a clash with China now. And that is why Secretary Blinken was sent to Beijing. That is why the US has been moving heaven and earth to get Secretary Blinken to get to Beijing, while they've been trying to persuade the Chinese to agree to receive him, something which the Chinese up to this point have been extremely reluctant to do. And many have commented, and it's caused some anger in the United States, in fact, a great deal of anger in the United States, that the State Department readout of Secretary Blinken's visit appeared to say that the United States not only accepts that Taiwan is part of China, but also says that the United States will not support any move by Taiwan to declare itself independent of China. Now, I said in my program yesterday that the overall contours, the framework of this visit by Blinken to China will have been agreed in advance, and it was almost certainly agreed over the course of a secret visit, which we are told took place by William Burns, the CIA director, to Beijing. And over the course of that visit, I suspect the Chinese will have made it absolutely clear to Burns that the only way in which the Chinese would even consider receiving Blinken is if Blinken and the State Department reaffirmed, as they have now done, that the United States accepts that Taiwan is a part of China and that the United States will not support any secessionist moves, any move by Taiwan to declare independence. So that was the price the Chinese exacted in advance for Blinken's visit. And the US did that. They made this statement in the readout of Blinken's visit. The US State Department included this in the readout. And it also, the State Department has apparently also made certain further changes to its website to downplay US support for the Taiwan, to give the clear impression that Taiwan is to again acknowledge the fact that Taiwan is a part of China. As I said, I think all of this will have been insisted upon by the Chinese in advance of the visit. And I ought to say it's interesting to see that some people in the United States are angry with the fact that Blinken made these supposed concessions. As Larry Johnson and I myself have pointed out, on numerous occasions, the United States accepted that Taiwan was a part of China, all the way back in the 1970s when the US first established relations with China following President Nixon's visit to Beijing in 1972. So all that these statements from the State Department do is reaffirm what is supposed to be existing US policy. And can I also say that it's also particularly interesting to see that Republicans of a certain type, the Lindsey Graham School of Foreign Policy, seem to be particularly outraged by these words in the readout. They seem to be oblivious to the fact that it was a Republican president, Richard Nixon, who first acknowledged the fact that Taiwan was a part of China and that the government of China, the legitimate government of China, was the one in Beijing. Anyway, just making these points. It's strange how people tend to forget these things or overlook these things. But anyway, there we are. So that, I think, explains some of the things that happened, some of these comments about Taiwan, which have created so much of a stir in the United States. But to repeat my point again from yesterday, what happened was that despite being forced to make all of these concessions, Blinken arrived in Beijing and was hammered by the Chinese officials, by Qin Gang, the foreign minister, and Wang Yi, the member of the Politburo in overall charge of foreign policy. I mean, the Chinese readouts are astonishing. And yes, afterwards, after this sort of drubbing that Blinken was exposed to, these so supposedly candid, frank discussions that took place after this extraordinary drubbing, one of which lasted, the one with Qin Gang, which lasted for 7.5 hours. A battered Blinken is brought into the presence of Xi Jinping, and Xi Jinping is able to preside at this meeting regally and said, well, there we are, you've heard everything, now you must go away and make sure that this time you do what you promised. It was that was the purpose of this meeting with Xi Jinping. And to repeat again what I said on the program with the live stream we did with Larry Johnson, myself and Alex Christoforo on the Duran, I think what the Chinese were telling the Americans is that this is your last chance. This is your last opportunity as an administration to turn things round. Either this time you really mean what you say, most importantly about Taiwan, the most core of core issues as far as China is concerned, but of course a whole web of other issues as well. Either you really mean what you say and act on that basis and do so consistently, in which case, just possibly, things can be put back on track between us and you, or in the alternative, things will continue to deteriorate, and whatever problems you continue to have in Ukraine, you can expect that you're going to have more problems in the Pacific from us. Not because we're looking for a fight with you, but because we're going to defend our interests and our red lines. And I think that this is what, as I said, that whole meeting was all about. And there is some awareness of this. There is a very interesting article in the Daily Telegraph by Ivor Roberts, who is a former British diplomat, and he said that Xi Jinping, the title reads, Xi Jinping is humiliating the United States, and it's not putting it correctly. What it was is a discussion of Blinken's visit to China, and the title reads, it was as well that the Biden administration lowered expectations of Secretary of State Antony Blinken's visit to China. The long-anticipated diplomatic venture, postponed as a result of the furore in February over a Chinese spy balloon in the skies above the US, was the first such tour for 5 years, demonstrating how low relations have sunk. The trip did not go well. China spoke to America as if it were a junior partner in their relationship, and while Blinken's meeting with Foreign Minister Qin Gang has been described by both sides as constructive, with a desire to reduce tensions, the Secretary of State was, by contrast, exposed to an uncompromisingly stern lecture from China's top diplomat, Wang Yi. And by the way, I don't think that the readout from the meeting with Qin Gang is particularly different from that of the readout of the meeting with Wang Yi. But anyway, in both cases, as I said, Blinken was indeed exposed to a lecture, something which American diplomats are still not used to, by the way. It's usually the United States that delivers lectures. It is very rare for the United States to be on the receiving end of them. But this is what happened in Beijing on a massive scale. And I have to say that it doesn't augur well for the future of China-US relations. And Ivor Roberts ends his article, he says, that ultimately China's brinkmanship over the meeting, and it is brinkmanship, but anyway, that's his word for it, and Blinken's dressing down by Wang are all of a piece with China's growing self-confidence and assertiveness. The Middle Kingdom's message to the West is clear. You need us. We can get along without you. If we're going to get along together, it's on our terms. And I think this is absolutely correct. But notice the first part of this last sentence. You need us. We can get along without you. What is it that gives the Chinese the confidence to be able to say that? After all, China has to import many commodities to keep its economy going. Much of the assumption, the operative assumption, that has guided US policy towards China since the period of the Obama administration is that the United States could operate a blockade of the Straits of Malacca, cut off China's supplies of raw materials, oil, food, such things, and that would cause enormous problems within China and bring the country essentially to a stop and force it to accede to US terms. And that is also, by the way, what explains the constant and, for the Chinese, incredibly provocative US presence in the South China Sea, which is China's main sea access route, the sea through which many of its imports and many of its exports also are shipped on what are, by the way, principally nowadays Chinese ships. Well, the reason the Chinese are less worried about this threat of this great blockade is because they've taken all these other steps to develop connections with countries that can supply them with the energy, the food, the raw materials they need. So they made links with Saudi Arabia, with Iran, and other countries in Central Asia. And this has been, of course, very helpful to Beijing. But these are still works in progress. The key country, the country that can supply China with its raw materials, and which can do so through land and sea routes, which are inaccessible to the US Navy, is, of course, Russia. And you can understand, therefore, the critical importance to the Chinese of the relationship with Moscow, and why, whatever the US does, the Chinese will not compromise or bargain it away. And of course, if we go back to these words, you need us, we can get along without you. This has certain other implications, because it means that the Chinese, well, they're not invested in the war in Ukraine in the way that the United States is. They've spoken about being willing to broker peace agreements between Moscow and Kiev and things of that kind. They've not done very much to that end for the moment, but they've talked about it. But ultimately, the Chinese have invested in another relationship which is indeed critically important to them, and that is, of course, Russia. And that means that they cannot risk a collapse in Russia. They can't risk of change in Russia's political direction. And that also means that in the event that the United States does somehow sort out its supply problems and increase its footprint in the war in Ukraine, then China, with its far bigger manufacturing capacity, will eventually step in if they sense that an American and European intervention on that scale, unlikely though it seems at the moment, might conceivably change the dynamics on the Ukrainian battlefields. So I don't think the last is going to happen, because I don't think the Russians need that kind of Chinese help. But bear in mind that if pushed, the Chinese will step in and will do that, because they understand that it is first and foremost the friendship of Russia which gives leverage over Washington to Beijing. Well, that's the end of my program today. Be more from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our various programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, and Telegram. By the way, later today, at 1400 hours Eastern Standard Time, I'm doing my weekly live stream on Locals. If you want to participate, you can join us there. You can take out a subscription and participate in that live stream as well. That's up to you. And you can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribe Star, links under this video. And last but not least, also please remember that you can go to our shop and buy yourself the amazing things that you will find there: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all our great things. And if you like this video, remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon, and have a very good day.